Matthew chapter 17, beginning in verse 1. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And there he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. And Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I'll put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. While he was still speaking, a bright cloud enveloped them, and a voice from the cloud said, This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. And when the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. Get up, he said. Do not be afraid. When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. This is the word of the Lord for us today. I've asked this morning for Jamie to sing a particular song. One reason is because the last time she sang it, I wasn't here. So I was jealous that I didn't get to hear her sing it. But 2 is because it goes wonderful. You see the title of our message today is In the Presence of God. And this particular song is called In the Presence of Jehovah. And so, 1, I pray that you enjoy it, but 2, listen to the words of this song. Let it bless your heart. I often wonder what it must have been like for Adam and Eve as they were there in the garden, to be in God's perfect will, to be in God's continual presence, so much so that it describes it as God walking there among them in the garden. When they first sinned, and God came looking for them, it says that God was walking in the cool of the day in the garden, and He was crying out for them, calling out for them. That's how much so they were in the presence of God. How close they were to God. How much did that interaction with God change after they sinned and they moved forward with their lives? I can't help but wonder what it must have been like to walk with Jesus, to be constantly in His presence, to just talk with Him, to listen to Him teach, or to watch Him heal someone of some disease or illness or sickness or some malady that they had, blindness or what have you. To see His compassion poured out upon various people, including myself. How that must have been for those who were so privileged. To see miracle after miracle perform, water turned into wine, to see Him take just a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish and to feed multitudes of people, thousands upon thousands, right before your very eyes. And I asked myself, would I have recognized there in that moment that I was in the presence of someone so great? But more than just someone great, some great teacher or miracle worker, would I have recognized that I was in the presence of God? I read the Gospels and I read the interactions that the disciples had with Jesus, and you see that they had those same questions at times. They wondered the same thing. Who is this man? There were times that they think they had it figured out, and then at other times they had to scratch their heads a moment. At first they were enamored with Him right from the start. So much so that Andrew, when he first met with Jesus, and John the Baptist led him and pointed him toward Christ, and he ran and grabbed his brother and said, "Peter, we found Him. We have found the Messiah." And then it describes that Philip went and told Nathanael and said, "Nathanael, we have found the one that Moses wrote about in the law, and the prophets all wrote about." What excitement that they had. James and John left their father and their fishing business to follow this man. But even still, even after hearing Him preach about the kingdom, and after hearing Him correcting those distortions, we talked last week about these distortions about the law, and then hear Him expound on those and correct those misgivings and misfortunes or distortions that they had. After seeing Him heal the lame or give sight to the blind, even bring people back to life, even after all of this, when He does something as crazy walk on water or calm the raging seas, they have to ask themselves, who is this that even the winds and waves obey? Who are we following? Who is this man? And yet over the course of the years, these disciples, they seem to become pretty confident in who Jesus is. They believe He is the Son of God. And I would dare say, it may be a little bit of a reach, but I would dare say that perhaps they even begin to lose their sense of wonder with Jesus toward the end. That excitement that they had there at the beginning, that rushing out to find Peter or Nathaniel, that forsaking all else to follow. And I say that because you look at what happens in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus brings them out there and He knows that the end is near, and He says, would you just pray with me for an hour? Would you just stay awake and pray with me? But what do? Every one of them, to the last man, what do? They fall asleep. And I don't say that to say that I would do any better of a job, trust me. But I say this to give you some kind of a picture, a glimpse of the state of mind of Peter and James and John as Jesus leads them up the mountain on this particular night. Now here we are, we're just a week removed now from Peter making his big confession, Jesus, I believe you are the Son of God. And then Jesus goes on to say that if anybody would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. And I can just see these disciples sitting around thinking, yeah, we're good. It's all good. I've left everything. I've left fishing business. I've left my wife and kids back home. I've traveled all over the country with you. We've denied ourselves. We've left everything for you. We're on cruise control at this point. It's all good. But when Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up to the mountain, at this point, excuse me, and it says that Jesus changes before their very eyes, He changes form, so much so that He's shining like the sun. And a brilliant light is shining forth. And even joining them here on this mountain is Moses and Elijah. Now you would think that it seemed such a sight that would cause you to pass out or to tremble in fear. You'd be hiding around a rock and not knowing what to do at such a sight. But look at what we're told that these boys do here. Their reaction is, well, hey, Jesus, it's good we're here. You want me to go right over the corner and build you 3 shacks for you and Moses and Elijah? Like it's no big deal what they're seeing. They're seeing the glory of God revealed fully in Himself, and it's no big deal. Doesn't it seem strange to you? Maybe we're just not getting the whole essence of the story of their reaction here. Maybe it's much more to it than what can be seen on paper here, but it just seems to me that they've become so accustomed to walking with Jesus, to being with Jesus, that perhaps this just rolled right off the back, just another something that He's done, just another miracle that He's performed, just something else that maybe He's conjured up for them to see. Maybe that they've just taken being with Jesus for granted and that they failed to recognize the majesty of what was taking place right before their very eyes. They're seeing the very glory of God. And that's not even causing them to bow down and worship. But then God intervenes. And it says while Peter is still babbling on. And maybe that's just what it was. Maybe it was babbling because he didn't know what to do or what to say. And so he's just babbling and rambling because I do that at times too when I don't know, I'm confused and I don't know what to say, I just babble. And maybe that's kind of what is going on here. but God snaps him out of the wrangling. And it says a bright cloud envelops him at this point, even while Peter is still speaking. And this is not the first time that we've seen the presence of God represented in the form of a bright cloud or a dense cloud in the Scriptures. You see, the children of Israel, while they were being led out of Egypt, were led by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And when the Egyptians got hot on their heels in pursuit, that pillar of cloud moved around to the rear and put a hedge of protection between the Israelites and the Egyptians. And that cloud led them all the way out, kept them safe, and it led them to the mountain of God. And where that cloud descended upon the mountain, and then from within that form, God spoke to the people. And that's when He gave them the Ten Commandments. But I want you to see what their reaction was when God spoke to the people. In Exodus 20, verse 18, after God speaks all these commandments, and it says, when the people saw the thunder and the lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain and smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, you speak to us yourself, and we will listen, but do not have God speak to us, or we'll die. And Moses said to the people, don't be afraid. God has come to test you, so that the fear of God will be with you and keep you from sinning. Now, if we go back to this mountain that we're looking at today, with Peter, James, and John, we find this reaction. When God comes in the form of this cloud upon them, while Peter is still speaking, a bright cloud envelops them, and a voice from the cloud says, this is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. And when the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. I kind of feel like the Israelites had already grown accustomed to being under God's blessings and protection. And they had grown complacent in their attitude toward Him. And so that God had to come among them and He spoke to them in all His majesty and His splendor to remind them of who God is and who they were not. And I kind of see this same attitude developing in the disciples as they grow accustomed to walking with Jesus, almost taking for granted their time with Him. And so God comes among them here in a mighty way and reminds them of who He is, reminds them of who Jesus is. And He gives them instructions to listen to Him. And not just one ear and out the other kind of listening, but to really listen to what He has to say. After all, this is God speaking to you through His Son. I don't know, perhaps this is what it's like for us. Perhaps we grow so accustomed to walking with Jesus. We give our lives to Jesus at an early age, or perhaps in our teenage years, and we grow so accustomed to the blessings of God, and we walk with Christ daily, that we take it for granted. And oftentimes we fail to recognize that we truly are in the presence of God already. Perhaps we grow so accustomed to hearing about God's love that it no longer has meaning in our lives like it once did. Perhaps we become so complacent in our lives and in our worship of Him that it just becomes something else that we do in our week. In fact, we're so complacent in our worship that we don't even bother making it a priority in our life anymore. Oh, we go to church when we can, or when we feel like it, or when somebody comes along and makes us feel guilty about not being there for the week or two or a month before. But is that all our worship has become, an obligation? Perhaps we're so accustomed to hearing the name of Jesus and walking daily with Him that we think all we need of Him is just a quick shout out to Him in the car on our way to work or to school. And then we're good for the rest of the day. But I can't help but to think that God would love to just to grab a hold of us, to come along in a cloud descending upon us, like descending upon this mountain, to shout from the heavens, Daniel, snap out of it! Wake up! You are in the presence of God. Now listen. I know you feel like you got all this Jesus stuff figured out. But listen, He is my Son, whom I love, and with Him I am well pleased, and it would do you well to listen to Him. But you see, He's already done that, hasn't He? He's already given us those words. He doesn't have to come along and shake me up one side and the other and smack me on the back of the head, because He's already given me those instructions to listen to His Son. And you know one thing that His Son has said over in John, in chapter 14? Listen to one thing that His Son has told us. Jesus tells us, John 14 and verse 15, He says, if you love me, you will obey what I command. And I will ask the Father, and He will give you another counselor to be with you forever, the Spirit of truth. The world cannot accept Him because it neither sees Him nor knows Him. Now listen to this. But you know Him, for He lives with you and will be in you. I will not leave you as orphans, I will come to you. Did you hear what He said? You see, you don't need some grand mountaintop experience. Because if you belong to the Lord, if you are a child of God, then you are continually and eternally in the presence of God already. His Spirit is within you and in you. And that ought to send goosebumps down your spine this morning. You have the Spirit of truth living within you already. God's Spirit. He doesn't have to take the form of some cloud to manifest Himself among us. He is already here among us this very day, each and every day. Living inside of you, living within you. Each of you who have called upon His name for salvation. And the reaction that this ought to elicit out of us should be one of fear and trembling. But I want you to notice one other thing. Jesus came to the disciples after they realized that they were in the presence of God. It said they bowed down, face down in fear. But Jesus came to them and He touched them and He told them to get up and do not be afraid. Moses told the Israelites, don't be afraid. The Spirit is called the Counselor and the Comforter. The fear that we have is not to be a frightful fear. We're not to be afraid of God, but the fear we are to have is one of awe and of wonder. For those of you who belong to the Lord, who are His children, there's no reason to be afraid of Him, but you should be in awe of Him. We ought to want to worship Him, to revere Him. And for more than just 1 hour on Sunday, or more than just a quick shout of prayer over a test, or over a meeting, or over a meal. But we ought to want to be in constant fellowship with Him, each and every day, continually in His presence, so that everything that we do, and everything that we say, and every move that we make is an act to glorify our God, with whom we abide. You are always in the presence of God. Did you understand? So that He knows what you do, what you're saying. But more than that, He knows your needs. He knows your heartaches. He knows your struggles. He knows your burdens. He knows your fears. He knows our need of Him. And that's why He gave His Spirit, to be in constant fellowship with you. But fellowship goes two ways, doesn't it? I can't be in fellowship with you if you won't be in fellowship with me. God can't be in fellowship with you if you won't be in fellowship with Him. You understand that? He has provided His way, His Spirit, when you respond to Him by giving yourself to Him. I ask you that today as we sing our closing hymn. Maybe you're here today and you need to respond to God's love for the first time. You need to accept His Spirit in you for the first time today. I would invite you to do that. Perhaps you're here and you've not been living in a right relationship with God. You've accepted it, but you've been denying it. I invite you to make that right today. You've realized that you've not been living in His presence, but you are in His presence. Welcome Him into your life. Would you do that today as we sing our closing hymn?